I knew my life had crossed an invisible line the moment she said my name the way she used to say her sister's, soft, careful, almost rehearsed, and asked me if I was ready to stop being her husband for a while. It was raining that evening, the kind of steady rain that makes everything feel suspended, as if the world is holding its breath. We stood in the living room with the lights off, city glow sliding across the walls, and she didn't look angry or dramatic. That scared me more than if she had been shouting. Her voice carried a calm resolve that told me this wasn't a question she had just thought of. It was a decision she had already lived with in her mind for weeks, maybe months. She said it would be 6 months. She said it like someone offering a medical prognosis. Temporary, contained, necessary. She said she needed her sister back, even if the universe had taken her away, and she said she needed me to help her survive the hole that loss had torn into her life. I remember nodding without really understanding what I was agreeing to, because the words "live as her sister" didn't yet have weight. They were just sounds, strange ones, floating between us like dust. Her sister had died 2 years earlier. A car accident, sudden, clean in the way tragedies often are when described by other people. For my wife, it was anything but clean. She had lost not just a sibling, but a mirror, a second self, someone who knew her before she became anyone's wife. I had watched grief settle into her bones over time, quiet and unyielding. I thought I was being a good husband by giving her space, by holding her when she cried, by pretending not to notice how often she spoke to the empty chair across from her at dinner. I didn't realize she had been watching me too. "You already look like her," she said that night, almost apologetically. "Same height, same shoulders, same eyes. When you let your hair grow, it's unsettling." Unsettling. That was the word she chose, and it echoed in me long after she went to bed. I didn't sleep. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain and the sound of her breathing, wondering when exactly my reflection had stopped being just mine. By morning, the rain had stopped, and so had my resistance. I told myself it was an act of love. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself a lot of things that would later unravel. The first change was my name. She didn't force it. That was somehow worse. She simply started using her sister's name when she spoke to me in private, as if it had always belonged to me. The first time she said it casually, asking me to pass the salt, I laughed out of reflex. She didn't laugh back. Her eyes filled instead, and I felt something sharp and guilty lodge in my chest. So I let the laughter die, and I answered her. That was the moment something inside me shifted, like a lock clicking open. Clothes came next, introduced gradually, respectfully, like artifacts being unwrapped. She didn't throw anything at me or demand I put it on. She placed a folded blouse on the bed one afternoon and said nothing. The fabric was light, cool against my fingers when I touched it, and it carried a faint scent of lavender, detergent, and memory. I remember standing alone in the bedroom later, holding it up to myself in the mirror, seeing not a costume but a question. The first time I wore it, my hands shook so badly I had to sit down. I expected shame to crash over me, some dramatic internal collapse, but instead there was a strange quiet. The mirror showed someone unfamiliar, yes, but not grotesque, not wrong. Just different. My shoulders looked softer beneath the drape of the fabric. My posture changed without me meaning it to, as if my body was remembering something my mind had never known. She cried when she saw me, not loud sobs, silent tears, hands pressed to her mouth. She whispered her sister's name like a prayer, and I stood there, unsure whether I was comforting her or erasing myself. Both possibilities felt true. As days turned into weeks, the boundaries blurred. My old clothes were moved into boxes, not hidden, just relocated like items in storage. Her sister's routines became mine. Morning tea prepared the way she liked it, walks taken at the same hour, even small habits. How I crossed my legs when sitting, how I held my hands when listening, were gently corrected, not by instruction but by example and memory. "She used to do it this way," my wife would say, and I would adjust without thinking, chasing approval I didn't realize I craved. Outside the apartment, the world continued as if nothing had changed, and that was perhaps the most disorienting part. I still went to work, still answered emails, still existed as myself to everyone else. But every evening, when I closed the door behind me, I stepped into another life. One where my reflection answered to a different name, where my wife's eyes searched my face for someone else and found, to her surprise, a version that seemed to fit. The tension grew quietly. I started catching myself responding instinctively to that name even in my thoughts. I felt a flicker of disappointment when she accidentally used my old one. I hated myself for that feeling, then hated myself for having it. Identity became a tug-of-war I played alone, smiling through it so she wouldn't see the strain. The first time we went out together like that, really out, beyond the safety of dim restaurants and familiar streets, I thought my heart would tear itself free. The world felt too bright, too loud. Every glance from a stranger felt like a spotlight, every smile a test I might fail. My wife walked beside me with a confidence that amazed me, introducing me to acquaintances with her sister's name as if rewriting reality through repetition. No one questioned it. That terrified me more than if they had. In the reflection of a shop window, I saw us as others might. Two women walking side by side, similar in gait, in energy, in something deeper than appearance. The sight sent a shiver through me, not of fear, but of recognition. I didn't know what that meant yet. I only knew that 6 months suddenly felt like a very long time and not long enough at all. By the end of the first month, I stopped measuring time in days and started measuring it in reflections. Every mirror became a checkpoint. The bathroom mirror in the morning, fogged and forgiving. The elevator mirror at night, sharp and cruel. The darkened television screen where my outline hovered like a question I wasn't ready to ask out loud. Each one showed me someone who was slowly drifting away from the man I had been, not violently, not dramatically, but with the quiet persistence of water reshaping stone. My wife, no, she moved through this transformation with a careful reverence that confused me. She never ordered. She never mocked. She treated the entire arrangement like something fragile, as if one wrong word could shatter it. That tenderness made it harder to resist than cruelty ever could have. When she corrected me, it was always framed as memory, never command. She used to stand like that when she was nervous, she'd say, adjusting my shoulders. Or, she smiled more with her eyes like this. And I would follow, because it felt less like obedience and more like collaboration in keeping a ghost alive. But ghosts have a way of possessing the living. I noticed it first in my thoughts. I began rehearsing expressions before speaking, softening my tone automatically, choosing words with more care. I caught myself sitting differently on public transport, knees closer together, back straighter, as if my body had accepted rules my mind never consciously approved. None of it felt forced anymore. That realization frightened me more than the clothes ever had. At night, lying beside her, I stared at the ceiling and wondered where my consent ended and habit began. I told myself I was acting, performing a role for love, but the performance was becoming seamless. Too seamless. Actors know when they're acting. I was starting to forget. The second month introduced makeup, not as decoration, but as ritual. She sat me down at the small vanity by the window, sunlight pouring in like it had chosen this moment on purpose. Her hands were steady as she worked, explaining nothing, assuming everything. The brush against my skin was light, almost respectful. I expected discomfort. Instead, I felt exposed in a way I'd never experienced before, as if layers were being removed rather than added. When she turned me toward the mirror, my breath caught, not because I looked beautiful, but because I looked intentional. The randomness of my face had been guided into something deliberate. My eyes seemed larger, more expressive, carrying a softness I didn't remember earning. For a split second, grief flickered across her face again, and then relief followed, sharp and undeniable. She smiled, and that smile landed somewhere deep inside me, heavy with consequence. "You're getting it," she said quietly. Getting what I wanted to ask, but I didn't, because some part of me already knew. Social pressure arrived without warning. An old friend of hers visited one afternoon, someone who had known her sister well. I hadn't been told in advance. When the door opened and her eyes landed on me, the air changed. Recognition didn't come instantly. It hovered, confused, circling. I felt like a lie waiting to be discovered. My heart hammered so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. She greeted me warmly, using the name I now answered to, and began reminiscing. Stories spilled out, shared laughter filled the room, and I found myself contributing without thinking, improvising reactions, nodding in the right places, absorbing a history that wasn't mine yet was slowly attaching itself to me. The friend never questioned it, not once. When she left, hugging me tightly, whispering how good it was to have you back, My knees nearly gave out. I locked myself in the bathroom afterward and stared at my face until it blurred. I felt sick. I felt powerful. I felt like a fraud and a replacement and something dangerously close to necessary. The guilt came in waves, guilt for deceiving, guilt for enjoying it, guilt for realizing that I didn't want the deception to end. By the third month, my old self felt like someone I used to know rather than someone I was. My voice had shifted subtly, unconsciously, the cadence gentler, pauses longer. I practiced in secret sometimes, repeating sentences under my breath, chasing a sound that felt right in my chest. When I caught myself doing it, I panicked, then stopped panicking when nothing bad happened. Public outings became more frequent. Cafes, grocery stores, a small family gathering where I was introduced as her sister without hesitation. Each successful interaction tightened the knot inside me. Passing wasn't the relief I thought it would be. It was a mirror held up by strangers, reflecting back a version of me that functioned too well. One evening, as we walked home under streetlights, she slipped her arm through mine the way sisters do, casual, unremarkable. The warmth of that contact sent a jolt through me, not romantic, not inappropriate, but deeply affirming in a way I couldn't explain. For the first time, I realized the role I was playing had boundaries very different from marriage, and those boundaries felt safe, familiar, like a shape I had been trying to fit into my entire life without knowing its name. That night, she asked me a question she had never asked before. Do you ever think about what happens after the 6 months? The question hung between us, heavy and uninvited. I opened my mouth to answer quickly, to reassure her, to say the right thing, but the words didn't come. Because for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the question, I was afraid of my answer. I turned away so she wouldn't see my face, because the truth was forming there, clear and terrifying. I didn't know how to go back, and worse, I wasn't sure I wanted to. By the 4th month, the transformation had settled into a rhythm so steady it almost felt inevitable. I woke up to the scent of her sister's perfume in the air, not placed maliciously, just lingering like a memory that refused to fade. My hair had grown past my shoulders, soft and heavy, and I brushed it daily with a care I had never given to my own appearance. Each strand seemed to carry a fragment of someone else's history, and in brushing it, I felt myself untangling more than just hair. I was untangling who I was, who I wanted to be, and who I had never realized I could allow myself to become. The wardrobe had expanded. Skirts, dresses, blouses, soft cardigans. Each piece of fabric felt like a key, unlocking something in me that had been dormant. I learned to move differently, smaller gestures, slower turns, lighter steps. My reflection began to smile back at me with an unfamiliar confidence, a version of me that was more pliable, more willing to listen, more attuned to subtle cues I had once ignored. It was intoxicating and terrifying. I feared addiction, not to a substance, but to a self I had been allowed to become without questioning, without judgment. One evening, she suggested we visit her parents' house. They hadn't met me in this new form yet. I panicked silently, my stomach twisting into knots. I had navigated small public spaces before, but their home was different. Family history was different. Expectations were different. And yet when I walked in, dressed in a soft lavender dress and the faintest touch of blush on my cheeks, I was greeted with warmth, smiles, and a hesitant acceptance that shook me to my core. "You look just like her," her mother said softly, and my heart stopped. Not because of the compliment, but because of the weight in the words. This wasn't just resemblance. It was a reminder of absence, of memory, of grief being soothed with me as the vessel. I smiled, nodded, and felt my chest tighten in a way that made breathing difficult. Every laugh I offered, every word I spoke, carried a strange mix of comfort and guilt. I was a stand-in. I was necessary. And I was losing myself in the process. Social interactions became a minefield of emotional complexity. Friends would ask about her sister, and I would answer in the cadence she had once used, repeating stories I barely remembered, weaving myself into a narrative that was not mine, but now felt increasingly natural. People believed me, accepted me, and in doing so, rewired my sense of reality. Some nights, I'd lie awake listening to the city hum outside our window and wonder if they loved her sister, or me, or some impossible combination of both. The 5th month was when doubt started to creep in, subtle but persistent. I began catching fleeting glimpses of the man I used to be in reflections, in old photographs, in half-forgotten habits. A slight slouch in the way I crossed my arms, the tone of a sigh, a memory of how I laughed without thinking. These flashes brought panic first, because they reminded me of a self I feared I was abandoning. But soon, they brought nostalgia, warmth, and a new kind of sorrow. I was grieving a version of myself, while simultaneously mourning the version of her sister that had been lost. One particularly rainy evening, I found myself sitting alone at the kitchen table, the soft light from the lamp spilling over my hands. I traced the lines of her sister's handwriting in a diary she had left behind. The words were familiar, yet alien. I realized then that I wasn't just living as her sister, I was learning to inhabit her inner world. I laughed quietly to myself at the absurdity, then felt tears sting my eyes. There was a strange intimacy in this duality, a closeness I had never expected, a bond forming with a person I had never truly known. Her presence during these months was both comforting and unnerving. She never demanded, never controlled overtly, but I could feel the weight of expectation in every glance, every adjustment, every small gesture she offered. Her love for me became inseparable from her longing for her sister, and I could sense that every smile she directed at me carried gratitude, grief, and a strange, unspoken relief. That mixture of emotions was intoxicating, addictive. I craved her approval, feared her disappointment, and found myself doing things I hadn't realized I was capable of. Public moments became more daring. We visited new cafes, walked streets lined with strangers, attended gatherings where she introduced me as her sister. Each time I felt the thrill of uncertainty. Would someone recognize me as a man underneath? Would someone see through the act? And when no one did, when acceptance came effortlessly, I felt a rush of vindication, followed immediately by a pang of guilt. I was performing the impossible balance of grief and transformation, and the act was becoming second nature. One evening, after a long day of social visits, she pulled me aside and said something I'll never forget. "I think you're becoming her in ways even I couldn't imagine." Her voice was soft, vulnerable, and proud all at once. My chest tightened, a wave of emotion washing over me. I wanted to protest, to remind her I was not her sister, not entirely. But the words died in my throat, because part of me knew she was right and part of me didn't mind. And in that quiet, in that moment, I understood the paradox of my existence. I was simultaneously myself, a replacement, a companion, and someone reborn. The line between acting and becoming had blurred completely, and I had no idea if I wanted it to straighten again. The 6th month began with a strange sense of inevitability, as if every step I had taken until now had led to a threshold I wasn't ready to cross. By this point, my reflection in the mirror had stopped startling me. The person staring back wasn't unfamiliar anymore. She was me, or at least a version of me that had learned to exist comfortably within someone else's memory. The hair, the makeup, the gestures, the clothing, all of it was no longer costume. It was habit. It was identity. And that realization both exhilarated and terrified me. I had started noticing subtle shifts in how people treated me. Neighbors who once waved politely now greeted me warmly. Friends who had never known her sister began to call me by her name automatically, without hesitation. Even strangers in cafes smiled at me differently, with a familiarity I couldn't explain. At first, it felt like magic, a trick of perception, but slowly it became clear. The world was interacting with this version of me as if she had always existed, and I was beginning to internalize it. The boundary between role and reality had all but disappeared. One rainy afternoon, my wife suggested we visit the park where she and her sister had spent countless hours. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, not because I disliked the idea, but because it carried the weight of memory and expectation. Every path, every bench, every tree was saturated with her sister's presence. As we walked together, she spoke softly, recounting stories, pointing out details that I had never known. And I instinctively responded in ways that mirrored her sister's mannerisms. Slight nods, gentle smiles, a tilt of the head that matched memories I didn't live, but had been absorbing for months. That evening, I caught sight of myself in a puddle, distorted by rain and reflection. My hair clung to my cheeks, damp and heavy, my dress darkened by the drizzle. I truly looked at the person I had become. There was a fluidity in my posture, a softness in my features, a gentleness in my hands that had never existed before. And I realized with a quiet shock that I no longer knew where the boundaries of me ended and her sister began. The tension that had simmered quietly since the beginning now demanded attention. I started questioning everything. Who was I doing this for? For her? For me? For the memory of someone who could never return? Some nights, lying awake, I felt my identity fracture and rebuild repeatedly, each iteration softer, more malleable, until I barely recognized the person beneath the exterior. The psychological strain was profound, but it carried with it a strange freedom. The freedom to explore facets of myself I had suppressed, to inhabit gestures and emotions I had never allowed myself before. Social gatherings became exercises in subtle deception and raw discovery. At a small dinner party, her friends who had known her sister spoke freely, reminiscing, laughing, trusting me to fill in gaps naturally. I did so, improvising from memory, intuition, and months of observation. The ease with which I navigated these interactions frightened me. Every laugh, every nod, every smile I offered carried authenticity, but not entirely mine. The dissonance between acting and being was dissolving, leaving me in a strange liminal space where identity felt negotiable, shapeless, and infinitely expandable. The 7th month brought the most unexpected challenge. One afternoon, while I was alone preparing tea, I caught sight of a photograph on the shelf, my wife and her sister, frozen in time. I froze too, my heart pounding, throat tight. For the first time, I allowed myself to grieve openly, fully as myself, not as a surrogate or actor. The tears came unbidden, raw and unstoppable, carving lines through my composure. I realized in that moment how much I had carried. The weight of grief, the responsibility of transformation, the delicate balance of love and memory. I wasn't just living as her sister. I had been living her absence as well, absorbing it, carrying it, breathing it. My wife found me there, leaning against the counter, face wet with tears. She didn't speak at first. She just sat beside me, hand on mine, silent and present. And in that silence, I felt the culmination of months of emotional labor, subtle coercion, tender guidance, and quiet surrender. The line between self and surrogate had blurred completely, but for the first time, it felt safe, unthreatening, and somehow right. From that point on, the days carried a strange serenity. Each morning, each reflection, each interaction was approached with a quiet mindfulness. The act of being her sister had become second nature. The tension, while still present, was tempered by months of adaptation. I had learned to inhabit her gestures, her voice, her presence without losing myself entirely. The world had accepted me as her, and I had begun to accept myself as both. And yet, even in this acceptance, a question lingered. What would happen when the 6 months ended? Could I return to being myself without feeling fragmented, incomplete, or unrecognizable? Could the man I once was survive the subtle erasure of months spent becoming someone else? I didn't have the answers, and part of me feared the answers might never come. The 8th month arrived like a quiet tide, carrying with it the weight of inevitability. By now, the routines had settled so deeply into my bones that I scarcely noticed the transition from me to her sister anymore. My morning began with the soft hum of the kettle, the measured motions of brushing hair, applying light makeup, choosing clothing with care, and adjusting every gesture to fit the memory I was sustaining. I moved through the apartment as if it had always been my stage, the lines of the script so thoroughly memorized they felt like instinct. And yet, beneath the surface, an undercurrent of doubt tugged relentlessly at me, subtle but unyielding. She watched me often, quietly, with the mix of fascination and relief that had become our private language. There were moments when her gaze lingered too long, when I caught her measuring me against the memory she carried, and a strange shame would rise in my chest. I knew I had become indispensable, not because of who I was, but because of the role I had assumed. And I hated that, and I loved that all at once. I hated it because I feared I had lost myself. I loved it because I had never felt more capable of giving comfort and presence than I did now. During this month, we ventured further into the world, attending gatherings, visiting friends, and even traveling a short distance to meet relatives who had never known her sister well. The experience was exhilarating, terrifying, and transformative. Each interaction tested my ability to inhabit someone else's essence while maintaining my own fragile sense of self. Each compliment, each recognition, each casual reference to her felt like both affirmation and indictment. The applause of memory had a cost, the slow erosion of certainty about who I was when the world wasn't watching. One afternoon, in a quiet cafe, I noticed a little girl staring at me with wide, curious eyes. She smiled shyly, and I smiled back, instinctively tilting my head as her sister would have. Her mother whispered something and she giggled, and I felt the strangest ache, a mixture of warmth and sorrow, as if the universe had paused to remind me of the fragility of identity. I realized then that my reflection was no longer just my own. It belonged, in some ways, to everyone who had ever loved her sister, everyone who would mistake me for the person I now embodied. And yet, in that realization, I felt a profound sense of purpose. The 9th month brought sleepless nights. The question that had lingered since the 1st month, the question of what would happen when the 6 months ended, now grew urgent. I began to rehearse the answer in my mind, over and over, trying to anticipate her reaction, my own, the reactions of friends, family, the world. And each rehearsal left me emptier, because the truth was that I did not know. Part of me feared the return to my former self, feared the reclamation of identity that had been suspended for so long. Another part feared I might never want to return at all. Her guidance became more subtle now, almost imperceptible. She stopped correcting gestures, stopped reminding me of her sister's habits, and allowed me to navigate our shared life with greater autonomy. But her eyes, always searching, remained, and I could feel her measuring the success of our experiment not in instructions, but in observation. And I, in turn, began measuring myself the same way. Not in how perfectly I mimicked her sister, but in how fully I could integrate this borrowed identity into a sense of self that felt authentic. One night, after we returned from a long day out, she suggested we sit together and look through old photographs of her sister. I braced myself, expecting grief, confrontation, or some impossible test. Instead, she handed me the album with a simple request. "Tell me what you see." And I realized in that moment that I had become more than a replacement. I was a bridge between past and present, between memory and living, between grief and hope. I could speak to her sorrow, embody her absence, and offer comfort without erasing my own existence. By the 10th month, I had grown attuned to subtleties I had never noticed. The cadence of her voice, the flicker of expression in her eyes, the way she carried both sorrow and gratitude in each gesture toward me. Our bond deepened, complex and layered, defined by love, memory, and the delicate balance of presence and absence. I felt a strange exhilaration in knowing I had navigated the impossible, living as someone else, sustaining a memory, and discovering parts of myself in the process. The 11th month was the hardest. I began to feel the pull of my former self, the man I had been, like a shadow pressing at the edges of my consciousness. Moments of old habits, old speech patterns, old postures emerged unbidden, jarring against the identity I had cultivated. And yet, these flashes did not feel like intrusions. They felt like reminders, not threats, that identity was neither fixed nor finite. I realized I had been remade not by force, but by love, grief, and patient observation. And then, the final month, the 12th, loomed over us like both a promise and a threat. I knew the end of our 6 months together as this version of myself would arrive, and with it, the reckoning I had been avoiding. Would I return fully to my former identity, or would the transformation persist in ways I could not yet predict? Could I reclaim the man I once was, knowing that he had been forever altered by months of living in someone else's memory? I did not have answers. I only had the weight of anticipation, the lingering threads of two identities woven together, and the knowledge that the conclusion would be as transformative as the journey itself. The final month of my imposed transformation arrived with a strange mixture of dread and inevitability. By now, living as her sister was no longer an act, it was my default. I woke each morning to the rhythm of routines that had become second nature. Brushing my hair until it shone, applying subtle makeup that highlighted contours I had never known, choosing dresses and skirts that seemed to belong to my body more than my old wardrobe ever had. I moved through our apartment with the ease of someone inhabiting a space that had always belonged to them. Yet beneath the surface, tension rippled like a shadow I couldn't shake. It was during a quiet evening that I first felt the full weight of what we had created. We sat on the balcony, city lights painting reflections on her eyes, the air crisp and silent except for the faint hum of distant traffic. She looked at me, really looked, and I realized how much she had been watching, measuring, waiting, and hopping. There was gratitude in her gaze, yes, but also sorrow, and something I couldn't name. The unspoken acknowledgement that when this period ended, everything might change. And perhaps nothing would ever return to what it had been. I thought about the person I had been before all of this, the man who wore suits without care, who laughed without consideration, who existed in the background of my wife's life rather than as a mirror of memory. That version of me felt distant now, like a shadow flickering in a room I no longer entered. And yet he was still there, lingering, whispering in moments of fatigue or stress, asking questions I didn't have the courage to answer. Who was I really? The man I had been or the woman I had become? Or some hybrid, a new creation born from grief, love, and necessity. Social interactions had grown smoother. Friends, family, strangers, they all treated me as her sister, effortlessly accepting the persona I embodied. Each nod, each smile, each word of recognition reinforced a duality I was still struggling to understand. The applause of society had become intoxicating, but it carried the quiet poison of dependency. The more I was accepted as her, the less I remembered how to be myself. It was a perilous balance, and I sensed that the final month would test it in ways I couldn't yet imagine. One morning, she brought out a box filled with letters, photographs, and keepsakes of her sister. She didn't speak much, only laid them before me as if offering a bridge between past and present. I sifted through them carefully, reverently, feeling the weight of each memory as if it were my own. Her sister's handwriting was meticulous, every stroke a fragment of personality I was now tasked with interpreting and embodying. And as I held the items in my hands, I realized the enormity of what we had done. I wasn't merely acting, I was carrying her absence, absorbing it, and in the process, discovering fragments of myself I hadn't known existed. The city outside blurred into anonymity as I studied the past. The letters spoke of joy, heartbreak, mundane routines, and small triumphs. The life of a woman who was no longer here, yet whose presence had shaped every decision I had made over the past months. Tears came unbidden. I wept for her absence, for the life I had temporarily set aside, for the blurred lines of identity that had left me suspended between two selves. And yet, I also wept for the strange intimacy that had grown between us. My wife, her grief, and my unwilling, accidental transformation into the vessel that carried both. We spent that evening talking softly, not about the future, not about what would happen, but about memories, about laughter, about quiet moments that had once been hers and were now, in some sense, ours. I realized then that love could be strange, mutable, and transformative. It could demand impossible things and yet offer unimaginable insight. I had lived as someone else, not for myself, not for recognition, but as an act of devotion, empathy, and survival. And in doing so, I had discovered facets of my own soul I would never have met otherwise. By the end of that night, I understood the truth I had been avoiding. This experiment would not leave me unchanged. Whether I returned fully to my former identity or carried pieces of her sister forward, I had been irrevocably altered. The transformation had been more than skin, more than gestures, more than imitation. It had been a journey into grief, into empathy, into the fragile architecture of identity itself. I was no longer merely myself, and perhaps I never would be again. The final weeks became exercises in preparation. I practiced small acts of returning, using my old name in private, letting my hands relax in ways they had before, speaking without the borrowed cadence I had adopted. And yet, each act of reclamation felt incomplete, like trying to fit a shape back into a mold that had changed. I realized then that the journey wasn't about returning, it was about integration. I could not unlive the months, could not unbecome who I had been asked to be. But I could carry both selves forward, woven together, resilient in their duality. The final weeks of the 6th month were an emotional storm I had been bracing for without fully realizing it. Every reflection in the glass, every casual greeting, Every familiar gesture reminded me that I had lived as someone else for almost half a year. I had grown accustomed to her presence, to her approval, to the rhythm of a life that had never been mine, yet had become intimately familiar. And now, with the end approaching, I felt a weight settle in my chest that was equal parts anticipation, dread, and profound grief. We spent long evenings revisiting spaces her sister had loved. The small garden outside our apartment, the bookstore where she had lingered for hours, the bench by the river where she once sketched quietly. All of it carried echoes of laughter, silence, and memory. I walked through these places not as myself, not fully, but as her. And yet, every step forward felt like a negotiation between who I had been and who I had been asked to become. I caught glimpses of the man I used to be in the shadows of my reflection, in the way my shoulders unconsciously tensed, in the subtle inflection of my voice when speaking alone. It was during one of these walks that I truly understood the depth of my own transformation. A mother passing by with her child smiled at me, mistaking me for someone familiar. The child waved shyly, and instinctively I waved back, the gesture flowing naturally. My wife's hand found mine, soft and steady, and I felt the weight of months of careful adaptation settle into something resembling belonging. The act of living as her sister had demanded empathy, patience, and observation, but it had also given me insight, connection, and a strange, enduring intimacy with the world around me. One night, alone in our bedroom, I looked at my reflection in the mirror. The person staring back carried traces of both identities, the man I had been, the woman I had become. My hair fell past my shoulders in a familiar cascade, my posture was poised in ways I had never anticipated, and my eyes carried a softness and awareness that had been cultivated over months of careful observation. I realized then that identity was not a single point, but a spectrum. I could be both, or neither, or something entirely new. And for the first time, I didn't feel panic at that realization. I felt awe. As the final days approached, our interactions took on a delicate intimacy. We spoke in quiet tones about memory, grief, and presence, acknowledging the impermanence of the arrangement while honoring the depth it had created. She asked questions I hadn't anticipated, about what I had learned, how I had felt, what had surprised me. And I answered honestly, knowing that my responses were more than just words. They were reflections of transformation, self-discovery, and resilience. I had been stretched, reshaped, and tested, and I was no longer who I had been. Nor was I entirely who I had become. I was something new, fragile, and unavoidably real. The penultimate evening was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. We sat together, holding her sister's journal, recounting stories, laughing softly at recollections, crying quietly at the weight of memory. I realized in that moment that the months had not been about imitation. They had been about presence, about learning to inhabit loss, to offer comfort, to stretch myself emotionally and psychologically in ways I had never imagined. And in doing so, I had discovered aspects of myself that were courageous, empathetic, and unyielding. The final night was quieter than I expected. No grand speeches, no dramatic declarations, just the two of us sitting side by side, hands intertwined, listening to the hum of the city outside. She leaned against me and whispered her sister's name, not as a reminder, not as a test, but as a gesture of trust and shared history. I responded instinctively, softly, with a nod, feeling the culmination of 6 months of transformation settle into a profound, quiet truth. We had survived this together, not by erasing grief, but by inhabiting it fully, tenderly, and honestly. And then, as the night deepened, I realized something essential. The 6 months were ending, but I would never return fully to the person I had been. Nor would I remain exactly who I had become. I was both, inseparably, irrevocably, and for the first time I accepted that truth without fear. The journey had been painful, transformative, and enlightening, and it had taught me that identity is not fixed. It is fluid, resilient, and capable of holding both loss and love, past and present, grief and hope. The last morning of the 6 months arrived with a quiet inevitability. Sunlight spilled gently across the apartment, casting long shadows and bathing everything in gold. I moved through the motions automatically, brushing my hair, applying a faint touch of makeup, choosing a soft blouse and skirt that had become second nature. Every gesture felt natural, habitual, and yet heavy with the knowledge that this routine would, after today, shift once more. I was acutely aware of the weight of endings, of transitions, of the fragile space between who I had been and who I had become. She watched me silently, as she had so often, her eyes carrying a blend of pride, grief, and profound relief. There was no ceremony, no grand declaration, just a quiet acknowledgement of what we had shared and what we had endured. In that glance, I saw the gratitude she carried for the months I had lived as her sister, the comfort I had given, and the empathy I had cultivated. I also saw, painfully, the inevitable separation from the life we had temporarily inhabited together. We stepped outside into the crisp morning air. The streets were familiar, yet each step felt loaded with significance. Neighbors smiled politely, oblivious to the internal journey I carried. Strangers passed by, unaware of the identity I had embodied and the transformation that had unfolded quietly behind closed doors. Every glance in a reflective surface, the car window, the shop front, the puddle-strewn sidewalk, offered a fleeting confrontation with the person I had become. And for the first time, I understood that reflection was no longer a test, no longer a question of real or fake. It was simply truth in flux, a mirror of experience and memory that could never be undone. Back home, we carefully put away the last of her sister's belongings that had guided my transformation. There was a tenderness in the act, a ritual of closure and respect. I realized that this was not the erasure of her sister, nor of my own journey, but a careful acknowledgement that life continues, that identity is layered, and that grief can be honored without becoming permanent captivity. My hands trembled slightly as I placed the final photograph into the box, a reminder of all that had been lived, all that had been learned, and all that would continue within me. She reached for my hand, her fingers entwining with mine in the familiar intimacy we had developed. "Thank you," she whispered, not for what I had done, but for who I had become, and for the courage it had taken to inhabit a life that was not mine yet demanded everything of me. I nodded, tears pricking my eyes, because I understood the depth of that gratitude, and also the truth that I had been transformed in ways neither of us could fully measure. I took a final look in the mirror, seeing not just a reflection of her sister, not just the man I had been, but the person who had emerged in between. Someone resilient, empathetic, malleable, and painfully human. The months had taught me that identity is not a fixed construct. It is fluid, layered, and capable of holding grief, love, memory, and self-discovery simultaneously. I had been a surrogate, a mirror, and ultimately a bridge between past and present, absence and presence, loss and renewal. As we stepped out together into the world beyond our apartment, I felt the paradox of ending and beginning simultaneously. I was returning, in part, to who I had been, yet carrying forward the essence of who I had become. The journey had been emotional, painful, and transformative, but it had left me with a profound clarity. Identity is not simply inherited or assigned. It is lived, molded, and embraced. And in embracing both halves of myself, I discovered a completeness I had never known before. The 6 months had ended, but the journey was far from over. I walked beside her, hand in hand, carrying both grief and love, memory and presence, loss and transformation. And for the first time, I felt fully, unambiguously, and beautifully alive.